date anytime soon.
Okay, so you give the optimistic side, I'll give the pessimistic side, and then finish with a little brave hopes. Probably Jack Vance surviving in the next generation is just the language, and that is also the great effort. Certainly it's what draws me to Vance. Just the wonderful lyrical sentences, the vocabulary, just the pure vocabulary he uses. You know, even when he makes up words, I believe them. I think that's a real word. Abscolation. You know, the beautiful language is unfortunately the thing that's going to keep the next generation from really getting into it. Kids today who are reading so much, and that's great, but they're reading really simple stuff. They're reading stuff that isn't written down to them. And so the urge to search out challenging works is just not there in a lot of the next generation of readers. It's very sad. And you know, we're seeing a lot of science fiction history to disappear because of this, and it really worries me. One reason I wanted to do this panel is I wanted to celebrate an author I have loved, but who I don't know if the future will remember that fondly.
But do you think that is different from, like when I was a kid, I know that we all read simpler things and was related, you know, often things from Scholastic Book Services and such, and stuff that was a bit more straightforward, but that still didn't stop us from going on and appreciating more complex things in terms of both language and plot and a lot of other things as we got older.
Some of us, smart people among us, quite everybody in this room qualified. Yeah, if you're sitting in this room, you're qualified. The people who actually loved reading for reading, not just for the peripheral effects of reading, and so who would go after challenging works. Yes, there will certainly be people like that, and that's why I want to talk about the ray of hope, why Vance may survive. Is two things. One is the rise of ebooks and digitization, which is such a horror story for so many writers and authors, is actually going to allow us to archive things in a much more efficient way. Certainly, you know, it's very hard to find some science fiction writers in used bookstores anymore. The books either are in private collections or they are just pulped. They didn't survive. And that is a real problem. However, because Vance has continued to write into the 21st century, and because his work is still around, we actually do have a chance to save it digitally. And it will live on as ebooks forever. Those don't go away. They can be easily copied. And so, you know, even if the physical server architecture that falls apart, you can still have the digital ones and zeros around. The other reason why I think Vance will survive is Dungeons and Dragons, and this may be the redhead stepchild of this panel, but Gary Gygax, who invented Dungeons and Dragons, was a huge Vance fan. I don't know if people know this or not, but a lot of the game Dungeons and Dragons is actually drawn directly from Time Earth series. And the fans of that game are as rabid, if not more rabid, than science fiction fans. And will continue to cherish Vance just for his legacy in that regard.
Well, I don't think I'm as pessimistic as you are about people's reading habits not evolving with time. I mean, mine did, everyone I know did. Very few people read when they were 18, what they read when they're 38 and 48 and 50. And I don't see that changing.
And in fact, I think that the big difference is when you're younger, a teenager or younger, you're usually reading the plot. You want the sort of prose that gets out of the way. You want all the distractions out of the way because you want to find out what happens in the story. You want to quickly go through that. And I think one of the ways for most of us that our reading tastes evolve is that we start, plot can still remain important, but we start reading also for other things.
I certainly, I don't want to get the impression that I think the book is dying out or something, or that readers aren't going to read. People who love books really love books.
let's go to the positive side of things a bit. Instead of worrying about, in addition to worrying about the future of Jack Vance, let's talk a bit about what makes Jack Vance special that really draws us to it. You talked a bit about the language. We can elaborate a bit more on that, and we can also talk about some of the other things we like about Vance. We'll get to the audience in a little while after the panelists got a little more time. Want to talk a little more about language to get us started?
No, absolutely. I think that that's where Vance's influences are as well. Certainly, authors since Vance have taken that joy he had in pure words and run with it. The most obvious example is Gene Wolfe, who I think has to be, he has to have a shrine of Jack Vance in his house somewhere. The way, especially in the long sum books and so on, he just took that banner and ran with it as far as fast as he could. And unfortunately, in Gene Wolfe, sometimes it comes across as forced, whereas in Vance, the language is so effortless. It's complex language sometimes it's very simple, sometimes it's very lyrical, sometimes it's very blunt, but you never notice the transitions. The dialogue of a Cudgel the Clever, the kind of a Latin tradition, it just sparkles. It doesn't feel like cardboard villains and heroes reciting Buck Rogers dialogue. It feels like real people talking, but in diction and style fitting to their time. So it doesn't feel like the way we speak, but it doesn't feel forced or artificial either. It's just wonderful talent.
You talk about diction and style, and this is something where I think he departs significantly from, what's the word I want, the way people would speak in reality. The thing is, I'm not good enough at it to really give you an example. We see it as described though. When he has a conversation, particularly when he's got a conversation between the hero and some sort of confrontation, the people speak in a very artificial way. Can either of you find the word? If you read what he's saying, no one would ever say it that way.
And
It's
so
much
much
fun.
an extreme formal.
Yeah, formal, thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, the word I would use would be mannered, maybe?
Yeah, that's right.
I find that extremely entertaining, even though it's artificial, clearly not. It should be jarring me out of the story, but he uses it so skillfully.
Well, he combines it also with irony. The praise he talks about Vance's irony.
Yeah.
And that often, the way he's using, the irony that most comes through most in his dialogue, both in the way, in the formalism of the dialogue and in the manners of the dialogue, but also just down to what the characters say. There's one section of it's one of the Dying Earth books with Cudgel the Clever, where he's basically encountering these like crab-like creatures, where he's managed to basically kill one of them by shattering its back, and it starts complaining at him, "Oh, you've now killed me over nothing," etc., in very formal style, and I'm going to curse you forever. And his reply is, "You are being very churlish. Why are you being so upset over this?" And all of his mannered style of, "Wait a minute, he's just killed it," and that they're reacting back and forth in this formal manner over something.
It's
as
wonderfully
embarrassing.
silly and somehow fitting, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's irony in the truest sense of the word. Irony is one of those words that gets used very casually these days, but technically irony only should refer to when dialogue is used in a way that is hiding what's actually being said. And that's certainly one of the wonders of Vance is that Cudgel the Clever is quite well spoken at times, and quite pleasant and cheerful and charming, and yet he's one of the most just vicious and ugly characters in literature, and yet you manage to, because he's able to talk his way out of everything, you sort of root for him anyway.
Well, also you root for him anyway because often the people that he's encountering and what's happening to him, it's even worse. So in comparison, you wind up rooting for him.
Yeah, Vance's pessimism about people is really quite charming.
And yet, it's not necessarily just pessimism, I think. I think that he recognizes that there is, that people are going to be vicious and ugly to each other, and that they will do horrible things, and they will ignore the world around them. The dying is the best example of that, because you have this planet Earth where the sun is about to explode, and everybody knows it. It's there in the sky, it's getting bigger every day. And everyone says, what are you
Not
going to do?
explode, go out. They think that any day they keep doing,
Right,
today's
sure.
the day it's all going to get dark, the sun is just going to turn off.
But they never, but you know, they don't seem to care. They're just going on with their lives.
It's gonna happen.
Yeah, there's nothing they can do about it, so they just sort of make the best of the time they have left. And so there's that, but there's also this wonderful sense of humanity survived that long. And we didn't blow ourselves up with nuclear bombs, apparently, or if we did, we came back many times. And we were capable of building these incredible cities. The wonderful part of in the Dying Earth book, the foreclosure on the sea, is when you have these fantasy characters wandering into this science fictional city. And at first they're just like, oh, what is this strange god place? But then within a few pages they're like, oh, if I press this button, it'll do this. It turns out that life is much easier than I thought, because I got this control panel that can do all these wonderful things. And it's an incredible library in that book as well. So there is the sense that humanity, for all of its folly and small-mindedness, is actually capable of amazing feats.
I don't know if many people here have seen the Vance autobiography. This is me, Jack Vance, and then asterisk, or more properly, this is I. No, it's the other way around. This is I, Jack Vance, whatever. But he even footnoted the title of his autobiography. But one of the points is really clear is he did a huge amount of travel, loved to travel, and this of course you see in his books, because he can rarely resist writing something where he doesn't introduce yet another new, weird, and usually rather repulsive place in culture, with weird and rather repulsive places of food. And again, this is one of the real charm for me of the book, because I sort of think of him as the anti-Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead had this wonderfully idyllic Samoa that came mostly out of her head. And Vance has these wonderfully unidyllic natives wherever he goes. They eat awful things. They're vicious. They have arbitrary rules which here are almost invariably transgressions, and then they abuse them. And he does it in a way that vastly entertaining. Again, I'm not enough of a writer to be able to. Why is it that these side pictures? How did he get them to fit so well into the story? His stories without them would be just sort of limp and bland. But yeah, mostly not necessary.
But, well, they're not, but I think they're necessary in the sense that they are what makes Vance's books. I mean, if you look at the plots of most Vance, of quite a few of the Vance books, the plots are relatively straightforward. And what really makes the Vance books is the combination of the language and the world building in the widest sense to include culture building. And in Vance's case, I don't think you can't separate those two. I mean, his use of language is tied so closely to the world building that if somebody else tried to create sort of those same kinds of worlds and cultures but did it in a non-Vancian prose style, I don't think that they would. I often think of the Vance's language sort of sparkles, and that's what comes through in the way he creates his worlds and cultures.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think that if you dumb down the language of Jack Vance, the story can just fall apart. Because the whole point of Jack Vance stories is living in that world, being in that world, experiencing that world 100%. It is so hermetically sealed, perfect, in every facet. language or the wonderful imaginative settings or the trooper characters or everything about it is it's built like a jigsaw puzzle, and all the pieces have to fit together perfectly, or it completely falls apart. And when it does stumble, which unfortunately does it once in a while, you really start to think, wait, why am I reading this? This bizarre story that makes no sense. I have better things to do, and then all of a sudden, Cudgel is dragging dragon scales out of the muck, and you're like, oh, I gotta read more of this.
But I agree that it's very much an immersive experience where they all fit together, it all fits together. And if you're immersed in it the right way, it almost starts for a while at least affecting the way your internal language. At one point a couple of years ago, I read all of the Dying Earth sequels one after the other, and I found myself after a while thinking internally for a few days using the same kind of language that the characters in Vance would use.
You just don't develop the advanced character paranoia.
That's true. The only other time I think I ever did that is I once read all of Patrick O'Brien's books, one after the other, and I was the whole 20 book sequence in a row, and I was for a couple of weeks after that, I was thinking in the language of Brian.
Another characteristic that I think you see throughout his stories is the depth of history behind it. You know, he never goes to a planet that's just a planet where a scene is going to be set. But he always puts in a little, maybe making use of the story, maybe just mentioning it in passing. You know, it'll be from a guidebook and it'll mention that there are ruins from a previous civilization there. Not maybe human, frequently human, which of course is in many respects more interesting than alien because, most of us grew up in a place where there aren't any ancient human ruins. In Europe, you've got multiple layers of civilization that come and gone. There aren't here. Half of the U.S. old house is 100 years old. And here's something where the Demon Princess, the main character, sort of lives on what's Aloysius in the Vegan system, and he'll mention these going to a restaurant in the old town, and mention that it was cobbled by the mad monks of the so-and-so order 800 years before. It wasn't needed, but it just sets a scene so beautifully and anchors the whole thing in a much more real world.
Yeah, well, really good world building, I think, involves also history building. I mean, that's, going back to Tolkien, that's the thing that really made Tolkien effective. When they talk about Tolkien's world building, it wasn't just creating, here's what Middle-earth looked like. Here was this vast history that really gave it a foundation. And I think you're right, Vance does it very differently than Tolkien. It's all these little references here and there and often in footnotes that build up what's going on.
I would say that Vance does it in a completely different way from Tolkien. I won't say anything bad about Tolkien. I'm going to use Tolkien as well. But whereas for Tolkien, all that backstory is mythology. It's the Silmarillion. It's this is what the angels and the gods were up to before page one. Vance, it's much more about history as history, what human beings were doing for all that time. Human beings which have lived and died, and many of them have been forgotten. And that's, I think, the real brilliant masterstroke there in Vance is the sense of it's a long history and backstory, not only sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's a long backstory which is not only it's not just something that he knows and is written out a timeline somewhere. This is a long history, much of which has been lost. A lot of his characters are completely unaware of what happened 800 years ago. They know something happened 800 years ago. It's probably important, but they can't quite recall. And at the moment, it doesn't seem germane. And it gives this wonderful sense of you're not just reading individual stories or novels. What you're doing is you're zooming in on a world that is living its own life without you, that is going on, and you get the sense there are a trillion Jack Vance stories that were never written.
Jack Vance book. Well, there are two ways to look at this first. First of all, what would be your favorite Jack Vance book? And secondly, if there was somebody who hadn't yet read Jack Vance, but you really wanted to hook on Vance, how would you do it? What books would you use?
Wow. I would probably pick one of the Demon Prince's novels, maybe The Pace, you know. I've always particularly liked those. I can't really say why. I think part of it is, first of all, it's a nice compact series. It's 5 books, but they're not terribly long books. And it doesn't go on and on and on. It's got a beginning and end. The 5 really form a single story. They are set in an interesting milieu. I think he used it in some other stories as well. I'm not sure I can name it, but I guess I'd pick that. Of course, those are science fiction stories, and if you had somebody like fantasy, you'd probably want to go to one of the Dying Earth at a guess. There's so much. I mean, what's not to like with things?
But which is your favorite?
Oh, mine. Oh, that's a different question. Certainly the Demon Princes. I also just recently reread the Planet of Adventure Quartet, and that stood up pretty well. I don't think as well as Demon Princes though. And then some of the standalones. I really liked the beginning of Lyonesse, though it got away from towards the end, I think.
Oh, I think that might be the best place to start somebody off. Just there's a little bit of a connection to the real world. So it's not completely foreign territory to one or two. And then, of course, once they start, they won't stop. They'll want to read everything else. Although I think that, well, I'll just say that for me, my favorite is always going to be Rialto the Marvelous, which is a very strange book, and I have a very strange reason for liking it so much, which is I used to work for the United Nations, which was quite an experience. It was a distinctly foreign world that had no connection with reality. Rialto the Marvelous really reads like it's a United Nations of magicians, and you have all these incredibly powerful people who have no real interest except what they're going to have for dinner
Yeah.
what kind of entertainment there will be at the ball. And so these horrible catastrophes happen to them. Villains show up and try to destroy them. And they're really, they have to form these committees immediately and get together and have these long discussions about what they're going to do. You know, someone has stolen the Iron Stones. Well, gather the magicians. We must discuss this at great length before we take any action. It really resonated with me, just the people coming at work at the time. Although I have to say that the original Dying Earth collection it is a beautiful piece of literature, and I would put it up there with anything that was written in the 20th century.
A short piece I didn't think of as Green Magic. I think that's a short story, and I think it's probably as good a piece as the Grove. It's a brilliant little piece of fantasy.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with that.
Green Magic. A guy who's it's in our own world. A guy who knows that magic exists, wants to learn it, learns the magic, is dissatisfied, wants to learn more, learns more, is even more dissatisfied, and finally, after years of increasing adeptness and increasing dissatisfaction with what he knows, discovers that there's a realm of magic called green magic, which is the ultimate culmination. And he discovers further that his uncle, who had disappeared many years before, might have been an adept at green magic. You know, after great labors, he works out how to call up a being of the green dimension who can teach it to him. The being warns him not to learn it, won't like it, it's too difficult, and he forces his way in. And he spends 20 years going through marvels, it's fancy language, the sprites of the Green Tower, just so beautiful. And at the end of it, he learns this and becomes an enormously powerful adept and is thoroughly dissatisfied with everything. And he finally winds up sitting on a mountaintop, of course, protected from the elements by his magic, and just because he can't stand the drabness of reality, and discovers his uncle who is totally dissatisfied with reality also because it's so drab. It's really a lovely story. Some fans.
I think personally, if I were going to recommend to somebody, I think if it were somebody who I knew mostly liked science fiction, I think I'd probably go with The Demon Princes, which I think is a very good series. So I think, although it's an interesting series, and I think it starts out, the first 2 books which were written, I think
20 years before the last three.
Are much simpler books, and I think the last 3 books are better books. The first 2 lay the groundwork of the basic plot, but also by the time Vance reaches the end, I think he realizes he's set up some both technical and moral problems that he really has to deal with. That things are far more complex than he thought they were going to be when he started the whole thing.
Yes.
But I would recommend those. For fantasy fans, I agree that I love the first volume of The Dying Earth, but I'd also be tempted to recommend the subsequent volumes, because they've got sort of the characteristic Vance humor far more so than the first volume. And to me, that's something else that pulls people in. I'd also just be tempted to recommend some of the great short books. The Last Castle. When I was young, the one that pulled me in actually was The Dragon Masters, even though it's not quite. Reading it again, I enjoy it. I don't think it's quite as good as a few of the other shorter works, but it really just had this sort of sense of wonder that flowed right from his use of language, as opposed to space battles or anything like that. It was just the way Vance was using language in that, and how he's naming things that caused that.
Okay, that's one reason why I wanted to recommend Vance to other people. It's just that it's not the same old thing. It's not people with swords killing each other or people with spaceships shooting each other. At least not all the time. And so it's you get this. It's an alternative to 99% of what's out there. And I think that so many people think of science fiction or fantasy as this sort of monolithic thing. They think either Tolkien or they think Star Wars or who knows what. About people outside the genre. And to open somebody's eyes to the fact that there is more, and that may be Vance's greatest legacy at the end. This is pure imagination. It is pure sense of wonder. It is pure, letting the mind expand and letting visions go without limit. That's what I truly appreciate about the book. I think more than anything is that sense that I have no idea what's going to happen next. I have no idea how this is going to end, and I have no idea where it's going to end, what planet will it go on. That is just so charming to me. When 99% of what I read is just the hero is prophesied that he will find the great sword and kill the dragon and return peace to the land.
Yeah, Vance is nothing but not unpredictable. It's interesting how often revenge is the motivating factor for everybody in this book. I mean, whether it's a little thing where you're passing through an area and you accidentally make a gesture that you didn't know was obscene to the local tribe, and they pelt you with rotten whatevers, to the Demon Princes, the whole 5-book series is one revenge after another. The guy, Kirk Gerson, as a young child, his planet is raided by 5 space pirates call themselves the Demon Princes. And he and his grandfather escape, and his grandfather raises him and teaches him martial arts and this and that, and trains him to be, his entire life is to be devoted to finding and killing each of the 5 Demon Princes in one book of term. And marvelous time of adventure, interesting stuff, cleverness. And at the end of the last book, when he's killed the last one, he's enormously rich because he amassed a fortune in part of one of his schemes to knock down one of the princes. And he leaves and says, his final words are, "I am abandoned by my enemies," which is, I think, one of the finest endings to a book. Poor Kurtha, he's nothing to do anymore. His life is ashes because he has no enemies left.
I think that was my index of reserve.
Okay. Okay.
That's another great thing about fantasy. There's always a sense of fun with his books. You Cuddle the Clever, who is just goes from one misfortune to another, and is always miserable and complaining about it. You get the sense that he wouldn't have it any other way. That this is what life should be for a young baby: this constant adventure and never knowing where he's going to sleep that night and what he's going to eat, but knowing he can probably trick somebody out of what he needs. And there's it's not, the books are not amoral. There is right and wrong in those books, but it's either cheerfully ignored or carefully tiptoed around. And there's this sense that life is a great adventure, and that no matter how dark things get, and they get extremely dark, there's always the chance of something fun will come along in 10 minutes.
And I think that's a really good point. Even when Vance gets really dark, there's this sense that it's hard to get really depressed even, or when you're reading Vance getting dark, because there's this sense of fun that's sort of right around the corner from all of the dark.
I think he's very aware of this thing, which I think drove a lot of us to science fiction and fantasy, which is that no matter how ugly his world gets, it's still maybe more interesting than one you're sitting in while you're reading the book. And so it's escapism, but in the grander sense, it's not running away from your problems. It's escapism in the sense of curiosity and wondering what else might be out there.
Running toward more interesting problems. Are there any Vance books that you didn't like? Or Bobber Minor, or
No, there's always something. Even it's just the language.
Yeah.
He's not perfect. Any author's going to stumble every once in a while, but I think as long as he has somebody reciting those wonderful lines of dialogue, I'll enjoy the book.
It's hard to say. Part of it is I don't remember the ones I don't like. He wrote, 40 books probably? Close to that. And some of them are weaker. I don't think he's written anything that's really bad.
yeah, and I think in a way my reaction is sort of the same way, that the minor ones I don't remember much about, because I read them a long time ago, and I remember reading space opera and thinking, okay, fine. And at this point, if you ask me even what the details of space opera was, I'd be hard pressed to come up with some of the details.
Some of his early standalones that appeared as part of Ace Doubles are fairly weak.
Which is, I think that's generally true of anybody in the genre, especially on that time, when, during the paperback revolution, when people were getting paid to pump out uploaders 10 at a time, even the true greats of science fiction, the Asimovs and Heinlein and so on, are going to have books that they need to make a mortgage payment, and it shows. But, when you're talking about the greats, there will always be something in there worth reading if you have an hour to kill in the bus station.
Are there any writers other than Vance? One of the questions the Tracy's asks is about where can we go to read anything else like Vance?
Well, actually,
Matt
Matt
Hughes.
Hughes, exactly. He's a relatively unknown writer, which I think is unfair because he's, I think, very good. He's got maybe 7 or 8 books out at this point. And all but one of them are basically very much in the Vancian mold. He's got a series about Hengist Hepthorne, who is I forget what he calls himself, but basically a private investigator in the era just before the dying earth, in a technical civilization that's very rotten around the edges.
But it's about to flip over to magic. There's
Yeah.
a change about to happen in the universe, and they know this change is coming, that it's going to flip from a science and reason-oriented world into a magic-oriented world.
Yeah, and they're marvelous. They're wonderful stories. He isn't doing Vance ripoffs. This is clearly something that's his style, but they very, very, very much feel Vance to me. I've enjoyed them thoroughly.
I'll check these out. I haven't heard of these.
Matthew Hughes.
I was going to say Michael Shea, who
Yeah.
is just continuing the thing. He picked it up and kept going with it.
Hasn't done anything though. That's a long time ago, isn't it?
He had a story in a collection like 2 years ago.
I didn't know that.
It wasn't even a Dying Earth collection. It was just some random fantasy collection. And he said, we'll set the Dying Earth. And I think Cudgel shows up as a cameo in the story, mostly just as a nod. But maybe a little older than that, but like the Niv Naline books certainly read like an heir to Vance. They are, again, he has his own style, which is slightly different, and his characters are maybe not as robustly cheerful, but they really are excellent books. Michael Shea. The book I think is called Nift Naline. It's Nifft. And it's about a thief who has to break into hell to steal something from hell, and it's just wonderfully imaginative. The way he describes hell, and it's actually, that's just one story in the collection. And he has other, the character goes on to do various other bizarre thefts. But the worlds he creates are just, it's like going into a Burroughs painting or something, or one of Bosch. It's just so detailed, and yet it all fits together in that same puzzle-like way. And certainly, I mentioned Gene Wolfe earlier, and very different from Vance in many ways, but with that same love of pure language, pure words. Wolfe is famous for putting in words that sound like he made them up, but turn out to be hiding in some weird corner of the Oxford English Dictionary. I think he probably just sits there going through the thing with the magnifying glass, like looking for but also you get that sense in his Long Sun stories. You get this story. What's the first one? It's Shadow of the Executioner. You get the sense of the same sense of the bigger world. There is this huge world with its own history that the characters don't even know that much about, but it's been going on without them for quite a long time. And it's that same dying world kind of thing, but the characters, like in Vance, have their own agendas that aren't about the end of the world.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to ask if the audience has anything that they would like to add at this point. We'll go you, and then we'll go to the back.
In looking at Vance, sometimes I see some text and material that is so very academic, and his character is so dry and academic, that I look at it and I just say, you can't do that, but Vance can.
Well, sort of one of the rules in quotes of fiction writing is that you're not supposed to be putting footnotes in all over the place. And Vance and Terry Pratchett, of course, also in a different way does it now, gets away with footnotes. In fact, one of the things that I did for the book that we did for Lone Star Con was, in addition to including a number of Vance stories, we collected a group of the more interesting Vance footnotes.
The Vance Encyclopedia.
Yeah.
So, Actually, that's one thing I've always wondered. Is Pratchett's sometimes heavy use of footnote almost like his little nudge and wink homage? Sometimes I wondered that. No way to know, really.
Well, Pratchett, when he was in his early days, Pratchett explicitly said it was he called it Douglas Adams technique. So you have to find out if Douglas Adams was to be as a homage.
Although Pratchett often gets compared to Adams for obvious reasons, but I think Neil Gaiman had a great quote, which was that Douglas Adams went on to be Douglas Adams, and Terry Pratchett went on to be Terry Pratchett. They diverged, and Pratchett has a love for both books and the way, not just the physical things, but the old publishing techniques, and he loves to play with sort of antiquated notions of what a page should look like. One of the things he does is he doesn't use chapter numbers, except for his old books, because he feels that they're artificial barriers to the story. But the footnotes are certainly a callback to, I think, 19th century writing.
Okay.
About a year ago or so, there was a really great interview that the fellow who does Starship Sofa, which is an audio blog, did with Vance. It's about an hour long, and it's very great if you haven't heard it.
Okay.
And in it, Vance basically says, you know, I didn't really read a lot of the science fiction stories. I was just trying to tell a good story. And when you were talking about his style earlier, I was thinking, I haven't read too much Vance, but of the like half dozen books that I read, the two that really stick out to me are like Eyes of the Overlord and Showboat World. And I'm not sure where they fit into all the series, but
Well, Eyes of the Overworld's part of the Dying Earth.
Yeah, Cudgel,
And
yeah.
Showboat World's a sequel to Blue Planet.
So I was just going to say that to me, when I just read them, they seem to me like the picaresque novel tradition. Like, you know, this is a series of like crazy adventures, and it's really kind of the journey itself that was the story. At least that was my view.
And a lot of Vance books are like that. And Big Planet is probably a prime example of this. That really the whole book is wandering from one place to the other and finding yet more strange and interesting things at each place you get to.
Yeah, if I can speak to that, I think that you got a great point about Vance, which is I think he does draw a lot from, say, Don Quixote or Tristram Shandy, that picaresque tradition, but also that just sarcastic picaresque tradition. Not just wandering characters, but characters who are, you know, annoyed by the scenery that they see before them.
I have a comment. I used to proofread before computers, and this was over 20 years ago, and I feel like me, I'm still trying to remember which one I did. I had a proofread Vance that was going to reissue it at the time, and you were talking about all those footnotes, I almost went mad. I really did. I enjoyed it, but I mean, because of the use of the way he uses language, it was one of the more difficult things I had to do. I did a whole bunch of, so I can't tell you which one it was. I mean, I did do a whole bunch of Vance, I mean, different authors, and when you're proofreading it, you know, some people have a tendency to want to line it, and you should never do that. I'm talking about where they actually change the sense and meaning of the sentence, and I'm just, I admit that was a challenge. They didn't pay me enough.
Yeah, as an author, I'll say thank you for your service. It's a pretty thankless job. So
It is. Nobody knows that you're doing that, and like I said, it's much easier on a computer.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I gotta say, pity the poor typesetters.
Oh, yeah.
Who had to feel all those footnotes and make sure there were no widows or orphans.
People may not know when you're proofreading, but people do certainly know when nobody's proofreading.
Right.
Exactly.
Was it the book a year or so ago, a book came out in honor of the
Yes.
Dying Earth stories?
Yes.
There was some indication that Vance won't be putting anything else out in it. It is sacred.
Vance is, two comments. One, yes, there was Songs of the Dying Bird edited by, I think it was George Martin, and was it Jonathan Strahan the other editor, or was Gardner the other editor? I don't recall. Yeah, Vance has stated, I think in fact he stated in his memoir that was the last, that memoir was the last.
Is there a Scott Cleek here?
Sorry, he found the match.
Yes.
But you know, Vance, he's completely blind and has been for a
He's
number of
been blind
years,
for 30 years.
Back at MagicCon, he was mostly blind. I think he wasn't completely blind yet at MagicCon, but he was, you know, there was severe
Well,
limitations.
in '85, I wound up helping run this autograph session, and Priscilla did also, and her job was to sit there and put his hand on the page
Okay.
where he was to sign. So he may not have been completely blind, but I think he was functionally blind.
Okay.
Still plays music.
That was '85.
Yeah, I remember that at MagicCon, because there was a huge line for him, and a friend of mine from New York who had moved to Florida, we met, hooked up at the Jack Vance autograph line, and my friend is like really into odd music and jazz, and he launches into this huge conversation with Jack, because I let him come online with me just to talk to me. He didn't have anything to sign. Jack can't see, and then there's literally 500 people standing there while my clueless friend is going on and on and on about the music that he loves, and Jack, you know, and finally I think his son was there and placing his hand on the books and whatnot, so yeah.
But at least Jack enjoyed the conversation.
He really did.
He enjoyed asking long autographing lines. You got to remind people that, no, Mr. Vance cannot autograph all 27 books that you just bought. Autograph. He's an old man and there's a huge line. Pick two.
This conversation I think went on for like 10 to 15 minutes, and people were pulling their hair out.
What was the body count at the end of it?
One dead music fan, 500 angry fans.
We're just about out of time. We've got about a minute left. Are there any final comments up front?
I've got a feeling it's sort of unnecessary, but if there's someone in the room who has not read a lot of Jack Vance, it will be a good use of your time. I would recommend it.
I can't disagree with that. I think that if you're going to spend your time reading science fiction and fantasy, which you should,
Oh, I wish I heard more of that.
if you're looking for a hobby, I can recommend some great books. I wrote them. But no, read Jack Vance first. Yeah, I think that you won't be disappointed, and if you are